On this episode of Weekend Spin, Paul McCartney releases his second solo album. He will receive terrible reviews, but he will win a Grammy Award and his first post-Beatles #1 hit single. And a few out there will actually say that he inadvertently invented indie pop in the process.
Yay!
Released in 1971, Ram is the follow-up to Paul McCartney's debut release, 1970's McCartney. Now, unlike that release where he played all the instruments himself, this time around, he enlisted guitarist David Spinoza, guitarist Hugh McCracken, and drummer Danny Saywell. By the way, for all of you pronunciation trolls out there, Saywell is the US pronunciation, Sewell is the UK pronunciation. Since I'm in the US, I'm going to go with the US pronunciation. But you pronunciation trolls can certainly fight it out amongst yourselves since you really have nothing else to do with your lives. Now, this would also be the only release in McCartney's catalog that would be credited as being by both Paul and his wife, Linda McCartney. Reportedly, Paul McCartney was going through a great deal of depression after the breakup of the Beatles, and a lot of the post-breakup legal drama was still ongoing at the time that this album was being recorded. Some of this does spill out into the music on this album and even in the album's graphics. His previous solo release, McCartney, was savaged by the music critics of the day, and Ram also received similar negative reviews. However, in spite of this, the album sold well, reaching #1 in the UK and #2 in the US, and stayed in the top 10 US charts for 5 months. It also produced Paul McCartney's first solo #1 hit single, Uncle Albert, Admiral Halsey. So before we begin talking about the songs, I want to first let you know that I have only recently discovered this album. You say, how is that possible? Now, certainly, I have known of this album's existence all my life. But for some reason or another, it was an album in McCartney's catalog that I just never really got around to listening to until the last couple years. Upon listening to it for the first time, I very quickly began to realize that this album is incredibly underrated. So without further ado, let's talk about the tracks. Track 1, Too Many People.
Too many people going on.
This is probably one of the strongest songs on the entire album. And from the moment I first listened to it, it was obvious to me that he was criticizing John Lennon. With lines like, too many hungry people losing weight, he sings about the misfortune of others, and then contrasts that observation in the chorus by asking why one of his oldest friends, namely John Lennon, would allow the best thing that had ever happened to them, namely the Beatles, fall apart. You took your lucky break and broke it in two. Now what can be done for you? You broke it in two. First of all, I like how musically contradictory this song can be. This recording manages to have a roughness to it, and also at the same time, a very ethereal, dreamlike quality. Like I said, it's a bit of a contradiction. Then it goes into this psychedelic jam session at the end. This jam session at the end is a bit unexpected, but I also feel it ends a bit too short. It doesn't get much of a chance to develop or go anywhere. And if I had been in the producer's chair, I would have suggested putting a little more work and time into developing the ending so that it ends as strong as it begins. This really is still a great track, though. And I really do think that it's one of the best songs McCartney has released that didn't become a hit single. I also wish the album's liner notes had given me more information as to who played what on what tracks, but I will venture to guess that it is Paul McCartney playing the guitar solos. It does feel like his playing. So already, we're off to a strong start. Track 2, Three Legs.
My dog got 3 legs.
this track is a cool little lo-fi country blues jam. A lot of music writers note that McCartney created lo-fi with his debut self-titled album. But honestly, I think he started dabbling into lo-fi during his time with the Beatles. Consider the track Why Don't We Do It on the Road off the White Album. Three Legs feels like it could sit comfortably on the White Album, and if it's good enough for the White Album, it's good enough for me. Now, I have heard that this song is supposed to be a Beatles diss track, and I guess you could look at it that way, but you could also just look at it as a crazy jam. At the 2-minute and 11-second mark, it suddenly becomes a different song without even breaking a sweat, and honestly, it amazes me just how seamlessly it accomplishes this. Track 3, Ram On.
Ram on. Give your heart.
So I guess this is the title track. Now, first of all, I would like to comment on the weirdness of the opening. There is this bizarre electronic effect that morphs into a cascading, classically styled piano arpeggio that is, in all honesty, a complete and total musical misdirect on what the rest of the song is actually going to sound like. And I love how this opening section contrasts against the rather sparse, low-key arrangement of ukulele, hand claps, and voice that follows. But what I love the most is how the effects-heavy electric piano at the 58-second mark just lands right on top of the arrangement and sends this whole song into outer space.
Right away.
I would describe this track as deceptively inconsequential sounding. Because on the surface, I would at first be inclined to dismiss this as just musical fluff. But then the more I listen to it, the more nuanced musical textures I begin to hear. Paul McCartney, in my opinion, had a real knack for just popping off little musical vignettes that are kind of like a snack or a dessert. Mostly empty calories, but still quite delicious. This song is, in my opinion, a nice dessert. And while it could have been further developed, it is still completely enjoyable. Track 4, Dear Boy.
Dear boy, that she was just the cutest thing around. I guess she...
Now, this song employs the Tin Pan Alley musical tropes that Paul has dipped into with the Beatles. For instance, songs like When I'm 64 and Your Mother Should Know off of Sgt. Pepper and Magical Mystery Tour, respectively. It's a genre that he will, of course, dip into in the future during his solo career with songs like You Gave Me the Answer off of Venus and Mars. I think what sets this one apart from the other examples I've just mentioned is the incredibly complex and underrated background vocal arrangement. The more I hear this particular section, the more impressed I am with it. Now, in spite of its rather breezy tone, however, this is probably one of the most serious songs on the album. My understanding is that Paul wrote this song about Linda's ex-husband. And as I listen to it, he's basically telling Linda's ex, you know, you really blew it letting her go. No matter what you have to say about Paul McCartney, one thing is for sure, he loved his wife. Now, there are a few songs on Ram that have been criticized for going on too long, but at less than 2 minutes and 30 seconds, Dear Boy is one song on Ram that I wish could have gone on just a little bit longer. This brings us to track 5, Uncle Albert, Admiral Halsey.
We're so sorry if we caused you any pain.
Now, prior to listening to this album in its entirety for the first time, Uncle Albert, Admiral Halsey was the only song that I was already familiar with. This song, in my opinion, is Paul's first solo masterpiece. It's right up there with Band on the Run. This song also sounds like it could have been on Abbey Road. It does have that melody motif going for it. So does Band on the Run, by the way. And it wouldn't be the first time that Paul would take some unfinished song fragments and make something more epic sounding out of them. So it's interesting to point out that it was actually the album's engineer, Eric Wangberg, hopefully I've said that correctly, who actually came up with the idea of not only adding the thunder and lightning effects to the song, but also took it upon himself to combine what was originally a number of different musical fragments Paul had and stitch them together into one song. Of course, growing up listening to this track as a teenager in the 70s, I could never even have conceived that this song was a musical patchwork that was stitched together. And this is because each musical fragment just slides effortlessly into the next. I could probably discuss the musical construction of this song all day long, but I'm just going to focus on a few things here. Number one, the published key that Uncle Albert Admiral Halsey is written in is the key of G major. Typically speaking, with popular songs, whatever key signature the song is written in will be the opening chord that the song begins with, and it will be the closing chord that the song ends with. In the case of this, it would of course be G major, a G major chord. That's how most popular songs work. A lot of Beatles songs work the same way. But every once in a while, I'll notice that Paul McCartney will write a song that defies those rules. While it is written in the key of G major, the song opens with an A minor 7th chord with a D in the bass. This is what I call a tension chord. And then it resolves over to a D major. You can feel the tension and you can feel the resolve. We're so sorry, Uncle Albert. Then there's also this very dreamlike transition between the first and second verse. Here we're back on the A minor 7th with the D in the bass. And then it goes to the second verse. Now, this particular transition repeats again at the end of the third verse, but with a little change that will help it transition to the next section, which is the Admiral Halsey portion. And this time around it goes like this. What's happening here is it's going to a C major and then it builds up to a B flat, like that, and then a G minor. That's an A minor to a C major. It's such a well-built transition, it feels seamless. Uncle Albert Admiral Halsey is pure pop perfection in my opinion, and at the same time it's also surprisingly experimental. It is instantly likable, and my appreciation only continues to grow for it with each listen. I should also point out the very weird, not to mention sudden, guitar bit that rears its head just as the song is fading out. This last little musical interlude sounds, how shall I say, psychotic next to the rest of the song, and was obviously cut out of the radio edit single version that played on AM radio back in the day. I wouldn't hear this crazy little music break until I started listening to it on FM rock radio just a few years later. Track 6, Smile Away.
Small world, small world, small world, yeah, small world.
This is a fun little lo-fi rocker that also sounds like it could have fit on the White Album. Now, the more serious side of my brain wants to just dismiss the lyrics as throwaway. But there's just something incredibly fun about how nonsensical they are that keep me from doing that. I love the lyrics. I can smell your breath from a mile away, smile away, smile away. It's these goofy little lyrical play on words that I love about the song, not to mention its overall raucous tone. My more analytical side wants to criticize this track and say it needs a little more development in the structure department. But then my, hey dude, let's party side says, dude, it's only rock and roll. Track 7, Heart of the Country.
Heart of the country, smell the grass and the...
I describe this as a very jazzy, traditional country western tune, if you can imagine such a thing. Paul was living in a farm in Scotland, trying to stay out of the public eye at the time this album was being recorded, and this song is a reflection of that time period. Track 8, Monkberry Moon Delight.
Sucking Monkberry moon delight.
Silliness just abounds on this song. Of course, it abounds on a lot of the tracks on this album. And the lyrics feel very stream of consciousness. And I want to point out this track in particular as possibly the best illustration as to why this album was so hated by the music critics of the early 70s. They were all so very serious about rock and roll at this point. But given the time period, this attitude was understandable. We'd all just come off the 60s when everyone was breaking musical and lyrical boundaries and stretching the artistic limits of what rock and roll could be. But with Ram, Paul McCartney was just saying, hey, remember when this was all just a lot of fun? Understandably, I think by this time, most music critics were taking themselves and the music just too seriously and had kind of forgotten this little fact. Track 9, Eat at Home.
Come on, little lady, let's eat at home.
This song feels very Southern California to me. It has that laid-back, chill attitude that just screams SoCal. Beyond that, though, this song is just more silliness, mixed in with a little bit of sauciness, and I mean that in the best way possible. I love the whole food, sex analogy aspect to its lyrics, and, well, I just happen to love sex food analogies in general. Track 10, Long-Haired Lady.
Well, 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 well. Do you love me like you know?
How shall I say it? This song is just very hippy-dippy sounding. In fact, when I listen to it, it feels to me like it came from some kind of late 60s, early 70s kids show, like one of those Sid and Marty Krofft shows, only more acid-driven than those shows actually were. When I'm listening to it, I can actually see all the fantastical creatures singing and dancing together. And then there is that weird tempo change just before the 1 and 2 minute marks. For some reason, this part makes me cringe a little bit, and I think it weakens the overall song, but I do stress the words a bit because it's not enough to make me switch to the next track. And that's because this little misstep is basically saved by the wonderful repeating Love Is Long sing-along that will also close out the track.
Sing your song. Love is long. Love is long.
And honestly, I love this long repeat fade out section. This section runs from the 4 minute and 15 second mark to its closing 6 minute and 5 seconds. And I don't think it wears out its welcome because it keeps building as it adds on more instrumentation to each go round. While researching this album, I have heard a lot of back and forth on the internet regarding the merits of Linda McCartney's vocals on this particular track. I personally really enjoy her vocals on this track, and I think they fit the song perfectly. And I think a lot of this is due to the fact that Paul exercised good judgment in deciding where and when to use her vocals. Oh, and remember that acid-driven Sid and Marty Krofft show that I talked about just a moment ago? Well, it's that sing-along chorus at the end that plays during the show's closing. This is the part where all the fantastical creatures sing the closing repeat chorus as the camera dollies up and up into the sky above the cast and the closing credits roll. You know, this song reminds me that I really need to finally watch that H&R Puffin Stuff movie they made back in the day. From this point, we transition into track 11, entitled Ram On Reprise. Now, this is just a quick little 54-second musical flourish. It is based on track 2, and basically all I can say is that it gives us an alternate ending to Ram On. Finally, we close out the album with Backseat of My Car.
Sitting in the backseat of my car.
So when you listen to this track, it's no secret that this is his tribute to the Beach Boys. It has Brian Wilson written all over it. Beyond that obvious comparison, though, I would say that Backstreet of My Car feels like a musical show tune looking for the show. This is one of the few tracks on Ram that I feel goes on a bit too long. I'm not saying it's a bad track. It has a lot of cool things going for it. But if there was one track that I would have either cut out or would have just cut down, it would have been this one. And I would have preferred that they had ended the album with Ram On Reprise instead. Now, you might remember me saying at the beginning of this video that I'd only recently, within the last year or so, listened to this album in its entirety for the first time. Now, as to why it took me so long, well, it's just one of those things. It wasn't until much later into my adult life that I finally watched the movie Casablanca. But as to what inspired me to check it out finally, well, I will point to a video by YouTuber Elliot Roberts titled Why Paul McCartney's Ram is the First Indie Pop Album. As for me, I'm probably not the best judge of what is or what isn't an indie pop album. I'm also not going to say that Ram is his best either, which I do hear a lot of people on YouTube saying these days. I think that at this point in his career, he was still trying to find out who he was musically without the Beatles. I feel it was wrongly criticized by the music critics of the day. I don't think they understood it. But with each listen, I grow more fond of it. This album is still relatively new to me, as I've only listened to it within the last year or so. So this is the only version I own, which is this half-speed mastering on LP. It sounds fantastic. But those are my thoughts on Ram. I'll be curious to know what your thoughts are, so please leave a comment. Now, in just a moment, I'm going to disclose the name of next week's album. But before I do, I just want to ask you for your support. If you like this video, if you like this kind of content, you can show your support by hitting like, hitting subscribe, and also I will encourage you to hit the notifications icon so that you never miss a video. I also want to point out that Patreon supporters receive exclusive weekly videos that are not available on this channel. And if you'd like to access that and show additional support, go to patreon.com/TGR the original and just make a monthly pledge. And if you can't do that, I understand. You can, of course, just leave a one-time thanks, or again, you can just show your support by clicking like and sharing these videos with anyone you think might be interested. Now, in the next episode of Weekend Spin, I will be discussing another album that was really dismissed by the critics of the day, and it's one that I personally have been reevaluating. And that album is Never Say Die by Black Sabbath. Now, this album saw the band moving into some very unique and very different musical directions than what fans were used to. And like Ram, I think it is highly underrated. Find out more next week on Weekend Spin. And until then, thank you so much for joining me today. And I'll look forward to seeing you in the next video. Take care. Bye-bye.